for joining me today on Blessed Man Meditations. Today we continue our look at J. Warner Wallace's book, Cold Case Christianity, where a homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. Wallace is a cold case homicide detective, Christian casemaker, and adjunct professor of Christian apologetics at Biola University. Wallace's cases have been featured on numerous TV programs and channels, including Dateline, Fox News, and Court TV. Wallace is a recipient of the Police and Fire Medal of Valor Sustained Superiority Award and has a master's degree in theological studies. He was a vocal atheist for many years. He now uses his investigative skills to make a case for Christianity. He and his wife Susie have 4 children and live in Southern California. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue Cold Case Christianity. This time it's Chapter 2, where we learn how to infer and understand the role of abductive reasoning. Investigators utilize abductive reasoning, also known as inferring to the most reasonable explanation, or you hear it called the inference to the best explanation, in order to make conclusions when investigating crime scenes. They collect all the evidential data and make a mental list of the raw facts. They then develop a list of possible explanations that might account for the scene in general. Finally, they compare the evidence to the potential explanations and determine which explanation is in fact the most reasonable inference in light of the evidence. As it turns out, detectives aren't the only people who use abductive reasoning in an effort to find out about something that really happened. Historians, scientists, and all the rest of us, regardless of what job we do or what hobbies we have experience as detectives. In fact, most of us have become accomplished investigators as a matter of necessity and practice, and we've been employing abductive reasoning without giving it much thought. Wallace told the story of a coworker named Dave who, thinking abductively, would hug his children after they came home late at night, not for the purpose of being loving or affectionate, but for the purpose of determining whether or not they smelled of alcohol or drugs. Parents, spouses, and children all have training in thinking abductively without even realizing it. So now let's distinguish between possible and reasonable. All of us have learned the intuitive difference between possible and reasonable. When it comes right down to it, just about anything is possible. You may not even be listening to this video right now, even though you think you are. It's possible that aliens covertly kidnapped you last night and have induced a dreamlike, out-of-body extraterrestrial hallucination upon you. While you think this experience of listening is real, you may actually wake up tomorrow morning to discover yourself in an alien spaceship. So that explanation is possible, but is it reasonable? While it's interesting to imagine the possibilities, it's important to return eventually to what is reasonable, especially when the truth is at stake. That's why judges carefully instruct juries to refrain from what's called speculation when considering the explanations for what has occurred in a case. Jurors are told that they must only use the evidence that's presented during the trial. They're told to resist the temptation to consider the attorney's opinions about unsupported possibilities and ignore unsupported speculation whenever they may hear it. Jurors are also advised to resist the impulse to stray from the evidence offered and ask questions like, what if something happened, or isn't it possible that? When these questions are drawn by evidentially unsupported speculation, they're to avoid those types of questions if the evidence that's available to them doesn't support those types of questions. They must instead limit themselves to what's reasonable in light of the evidence that's been presented to them. In the end, our criminal courts place a high standard on reasonableness, and that's important as we think about the process of abductive reasoning. This rational approach to determining truth will help us come to the most reasonable conclusion in light of the evidence. It can be applied to more than criminal cases. We can apply the process of abduction to our spiritual investigations as well. But first, let's examine the concept with a real-life example from homicide investigations. Abductive reasoning and dead guys. Suppose we've been called out with Wallace to a dead body scene, a location where a deceased person's been discovered, and the circumstances seem rather suspicious. While scenes like this are sometimes homicides, they're often less sinister. There are a few other explanations. Deaths fall into one of four categories: natural deaths, accidental deaths, suicides, or homicides. It is the investigator's job to figure out which of the four explanations is the most reasonable explanation in light of the evidence presented. In our imaginary scenario, we've been called to the scene of a dead body report, or DBR, to assist patrol officers who've already arrived and secured the location. In our imaginary DBR scenario, a young man was discovered lying face down on his apartment floor when his roommate returned from work. The deceased was cold to the touch, non-responsive, and stiff. Given these minimal facts, it's clear that there's a dead person. But is this death a natural death, an accident, a suicide, or a homicide? Given the minimal facts so far, the potential explanations are still in play, aren't they? Unless we have something more to add evidentially, it will be difficult to decide if this case should be worked as a homicide or simply documented as something other than criminal. Let's change the scenario slightly and add a new piece of evidence to see if it will help. Imagine that we entered the room and observed that the man was lying in a pool of his own blood, and that this blood seemed to be coming from the area of his abdomen under his body. These are the new minimal facts. There's a dead man who's lying face down on the floor in a pool of blood that's coming from his lower body in the front. Given the new set of facts, is there any direction that our investigation might take? Are any of our four explanations more or less reasonable? Seems like you can eliminate natural death because he's got a wound that caused blood to come from his abdomen. Given the new evidence, we may be comfortable in removing the natural death explanation from our consideration. After all, what kind of natural event in the human body would cause someone to bleed from his lower abdomen? Without an orifice from which to bleed naturally, this does seem to be an unfounded conclusion to draw. A natural death might be possible, but a natural death is not reasonable. What about the other three explanations? Could this still be an accidental death, a suicide, or a homicide? Sure, the man could have tripped and fallen on something. We wouldn't know until we turned him over. What about a suicide or homicide? It seems that these three remaining explanations are still reasonable in light of what limited evidence we have about this case. But until we learn a little bit more, it will be difficult to decide which of these final three options is the most reasonable. So let's add a new dimension to this case. Imagine that we enter the room and see the man lying face down on the floor in the pool of his own blood, but now we observe a large knife sticking out in his lower back. This presents us with a new set of facts. There's a dead man lying face down on the floor in a pool of blood with a knife stuck in his back. The presence of the knife in the victim's back seems to eliminate as unreasonable the conclusion of accidental death. It's hard to imagine an accident that would account for this fact. An accidental death might be possible, but it's not reasonable. If nothing else, the presence of the knife certainly affirms the unreasonable nature of natural death, doesn't it? The most reasonable remaining explanations are either suicide or homicide. And suicide seems less likely given the fact that the victim's wound is located on his back. He'd have a hard time reaching around his body and inserting a knife with enough force to be fatal. But since the wound's located in the lower back within his reach, let's leave this opinion on the table for now. Suicide on the table for now. Imagine, however, that a new fact has entered our scenario. Imagine that we discover 3 extra wounds on the victim's back in addition to the one we observed earlier. Our list now includes the dead man lying face down on the floor in a pool of his own blood with multiple knife wounds in his back. Our reasonable explanations are dwindling, aren't they? In this situation, natural death, accidental death, and suicide seem out of the question. While some may argue that they're still possible, few would suggest them as reasonable. The most reasonable conclusion in light of the evidence is simply that the man was murdered. As responsible detectives, we would have no choice but to initiate a homicide investigation. Now we're making more difficult distinctions. We just used abductive reasoning to determine which explanation most reasonably explains what happened at this scene. It was simple, right? But what happens when the scenario is more ambiguous than our dead body scene? What if two competing explanations are similarly reasonable? Are there any rules or principles that might help us distinguish between the most reasonable explanation and a close contender? When considering two or more closely competing explanations for a particular event, or suspects in a murder, we should assess the following factors. First, the truth must be feasible, or the explanation must have explanatory viability. Before we even begin to think about the evidence related to a particular murder suspect, we need to make sure that the suspect was available to commit the crime in the first place. This is where investigating the alibi of potential suspects helps to eliminate those who are simply impossibilities based on confirmed alibis. Next, the truth will usually be straightforward. The explanation demonstrates explanatory simplicity. When considering a number of suspects, look for the man or woman who most simply accounts for the evidence. If one person can account for the evidence rather than some theory that requires 3 or 4 different potential suspects to account for the same evidence, he or she is most likely the killer. When one person can account for the evidence. That was the theme of the book Person of Interest, where one person accounted for the evidence for all of the elements that were discussed in the book Person of Interest, and that person is Jesus, and that's why he's the person of interest. Next, the truth should be exhaustive, or the explanation displays explanatory depth. Consider the suspect who most exhaustively explains the evidence that is available in the case. While a particular suspect may explain 1 or 2 or 3 pieces of evidence, the suspect who accounts for the most or all of the evidence is typically the killer. Again, in Person of Interest, Jesus was the one who accounted for all of the evidence. The truth must be logical. The explanation possesses explanatory consistency. The truth is rational. For this reason, the truth about the identity of the killer must also make sense. Suspects commit murders for reasons of one kind or another, even if these reasons seem insufficient to you or me. The true killer will make sense to the members of the jury once they understand his or her misguided motivation. Conversely, some candidates will appear logically inconsistent because they lack motivation altogether. Next, the truth will be superior. The explanation achieves explanatory superiority. Finally, I recognize that one of my suspects is unique in the superior way that he or she accounts for the evidence. In essence, this particular suspect is a far better choice when compared to the candidates who were offered. The quality of his or her connection to the evidence is better. When I see this characteristic of explanatory superiority, I know I have my killer. And again, Person of Interest, he went through multiple lines of evidence. Wallace went through multiple lines of evidence to show that Jesus is the superior candidate to be that unique person of interest that is that long-awaited Messiah. When a suspect meets these 5 criteria, he's confident he has reached the most reasonable conclusion. He's identified the killer. Now we will switch gears from our make-believe death scene to the ancient death scene, the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now it's time to apply this form of reasoning to a death scene that has been the topic of discussion for over 2,000 years. What happened to Jesus of Nazareth? How can we explain his empty tomb? Did his disciples steal his body? Was he only injured on the cross and later recovered? Did he actually die and resurrect from the dead? We can approach these questions as detectives using abductive reasoning, as we've already done in this chapter in our previous example. The question of Jesus' fate might be compared to our dead body investigation. We examined our death scene by first identifying the characteristics of the scene, the facts and pieces of evidence. We next acknowledged a number of potential explanations that might account for what we observed. Let's apply that same approach to the issue of the alleged death and resurrection of Jesus. Dr. Gary Habermas and Professor Mike Licona have taken time to identify the minimal facts or evidences related to the resurrection. While there are many claims in the New Testament related to this important event, not all are accepted by skeptics and wary investigators. Habermas and Lacona surveyed the most respected and well-established historical scholars and identified a number of facts that are accepted by the vast majority of researchers in the field. They limited their list to those facts that were strongly supported using the criteria of textual critics, and to those facts that were granted by virtually all scholars from skeptics and conservative Christians. Habermas and Lacona wrote about their findings in The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, a book they co-authored. When Wallace was still a skeptic, he formed a list of New Testament claims as he first investigated the resurrection. When he was an unbeliever, Wallace found four of Habermas and Lacona's minimal facts to be the most substantiated by both friends and foes of Christianity. Those four facts are that Jesus died on the cross and was buried, that Jesus' tomb was empty and that no one ever produced his body, that Jesus' disciples believed they saw Jesus resurrected from the dead, and that Jesus' disciples were transformed following their alleged resurrection observations by seeing him risen from the dead. You'll notice that none of these minimal evidences necessitates that Jesus truly rose from the dead. There may be any number of explanations that account for these facts. We'll get to those in a moment. This is simply a list of evidences that most scholars, believers and unbelievers alike, would accept, and all of us, believers and unbelievers alike, must explain these evidences. As he examined these bare-bones claims related to the resurrection, Wallace assembled the possible explanations that have been historically offered to account for them by employing the process of abductive reasoning. He quickly recognized that every one of these explanations had its own deficiencies and liabilities, including the Christian account. Let's take a look at the potential explanations and list their associated difficulties. First, the disciples were wrong about Jesus' death. Some skeptics have offered the possibility that the disciples were mistaken about Jesus' death on the cross. They proposed that Jesus survived the beating and the crucifixion and simply appeared to the disciples after he recovered. There are problems with this. While this proposal seeks to explain the empty tomb, the resurrection observations, and the transformation that occurred in the disciples' lives and the apostles' lives, it fails to satisfactorily explain what the disciples observed and experienced when they pulled Jesus from the cross. I've gone through some of this information before in other content, but Wallace, as a cold case homicide detective, has knowledge about death that other people are not as well versed in. And Wallace's knowledge about death helped me see this evidence in a new light and made it even stronger to me as I have gone through this chapter. Typically, when witnesses who first come upon a dead body of a loved one, they quickly check for the most obvious signs of life. Is the person who is injured still breathing? This test is simple and effective. Everyone's capable of performing it. Even those who know nothing about human biology instinctively resort to it. Three conditions typically become apparent in dead bodies. They get cold to the touch. They get stiff, temperature, rigidity, and lividity. Dead bodies lose warmth until they eventually reach the temperature of their environment. They begin to feel cold to the touch. This is often reported by those who find them. In addition, chemical reactions begin to take place in the muscles after death occurs, resulting in stiffening and rigidity known as rigor mortis. Dead people become rigid, retaining the shape they were in when they died. Eventually, the heart stops beating, the blood begins to pool in the body, responding to the force of gravity. As a result, purple discoloration begins to become apparent in those areas of the body that are closest to the ground. In essence, the bodies look, feel, and respond differently from living, breathing humans. Dead people, unlike those who are slipping in and out of consciousness, never respond to their injuries. They don't flinch or moan when touched. Is it reasonable to believe that those who removed Jesus from the cross, took possession of his body, and carried him to the grave, spent time treating and wrapping his body for burial, would not have noticed any of these conditions common to dead bodies? Surely, those who took him from the cross began to notice some of the physical changes in his body, since he was really dead. Surely, those who took him to the tomb noticed these changes taking place in his body. Surely those who wrapped him noticed the changes in the body. Surely those who went to anoint him before his resurrection, assuming they went to anoint him before the day of his resurrection, assuming that trip that the women took and didn't find him, assuming that was not the first trip they took to anoint him, they would have noticed differences based on what was just described. In addition to this, the Gospel of John records the fact that the guard stabbed Jesus and observed both blood and water pour from his body. That's an important observation, given that John was not a coroner or medical doctor. Wallace has been to many coroner autopsies and has spoken at length with coroner investigators at crime scenes. When people are injured to the point of death, such as the result of an assault or traffic accident, they often enter into some form of circulatory shock prior to dying because their organs and body tissues are not receiving adequate blood flow. This can sometimes result in either pericardial effusion, increased fluid in the membrane surrounding the heart, or pleural effusion, increased fluid in the membrane surrounding the lungs. Jesus was pinned to the cross in an upright position following the terrible flogging he received. It's reasonable to expect that this kind of effusion might have taken place in response to the circulatory shock he suffered prior to dying. These fluids would certainly pour out of his body if he were pierced with a spear. While the gospel writers might expect to see blood, their observation of the water is somewhat surprising. It is certainly consistent with the fact that Jesus was already dead when stabbed by the guard. In addition to these concerns from the perspective of a homicide detective, there are other problems with the proposal that Jesus did not actually die on the cross. Many 1st century and early 2nd century unfriendly Roman sources like Thallus, Tacitus, Marabar, Serapion, and Phlegon, and Jewish sources like Josephus and the Babylonian Talmud affirmed and acknowledged that Jesus was crucified and died. The Roman guards faced death if they allowed a prisoner to survive crucifixion. Would they really be careless enough to remove someone from a cross who was not really dead? Jesus would have to control his blood loss from the beatings, crucifixion, and stabbing in order to survive, yet was pinned to the cross and unable to do anything that might achieve this. So in other words, there's no natural explanation to this, given that he really did die. Jesus displayed wounds following the resurrection, but was never observed to behave as though he was wounded, in spite of the fact that he appeared only days after being beaten, crucified, and stabbed. Jesus disappeared from the historical record following his reported resurrection and ascension, and was never seen again, as one might expect if he recovered from his wounds and lived much beyond the age of 33. So sure, I mean, if you accept the biblical account that there was an ascension that took place, then it makes sense that he was never seen again. And of course, if he was seen again, surely history would have seen again after the biblical record instead of the ascension. If he continued to just go on about his life, surely people would have made record of this. But there is no such record, because what we have is Scripture. Another explanation is that the disciples lied about the resurrection. Some non-Christians claim that the disciples stole the body from the grave and later fabricated stories about Jesus' resurrection appearances. Problems with that idea are that while this explanation accounts for the empty tomb and the resurrection observations, it fails to account for the transformed lives of the apostles. In Wallace's years of working robberies, he had the opportunity to investigate and break a number of conspiracy efforts, and he learned about the nature of successful conspiracies. Conspiracies will be discussed in a later chapter, but until then, let's be hesitant to embrace any theory that requires the conspiratorial effort of a large number of people over a period of significant time when there's personally little or nothing to gain by their effort. Right, and then you hear Frank Turek make the point about how the disciples wouldn't knowingly die for a lie. And that seems to contradict the idea that they lied about the resurrection. This theory requires us to believe the disciples were transformed and emboldened, not by the miraculous appearance of the resurrected Jesus, but by elaborate lies created without any benefit to those that were perpetuating the hoax. Right. They were promised persecution, martyrdom, imprisonment. What incentive would they have for perpetuating a lie? It would make their lives easier if they just went on living as though he stayed dead. They wouldn't have to suffer like they did if they lived as though he didn't rise. But because he did rise, they put their faith in it. They had reason to put their faith in him and were willing to contend for that faith, even if it meant their own lives. In addition to this concern from the perspective of a detective, there are other concerns that have to be considered when evaluating the claim that the disciples lied about the resurrection. First, the Jewish authorities took many precautions to make sure the tomb was guarded and sealed, knowing that the removal of the body would allow the disciples to claim that Jesus had risen. Right, the Jewish leaders were very concerned that that would happen, so Pilate permitted them to have a guard, and they had the guard. But then the morning of the resurrection, the angel appeared, and the soldier was like a dead man. Yeah. The people local to the event would have known that it was a lie, that the claim of resurrection was a lie. Remember that Paul told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15 that there were still 500 people who could testify to having seen the risen Jesus after his resurrection. The disciples lacked a motive to create such a lie. I mean, it's hard to get 500 people to tell the same lie. It's hard to get 500 people to see the same hallucination, I would think. The disciples' transformation following the alleged resurrection is inconsistent with the claim that the appearances were only a lie. How could their own lies transform them into courageous evangelists? Right. If they were lying about Jesus' resurrection, they would have no good reason to further this story of his resurrection and preaching the message that he told them to preach if they knew that it meant their certain death. Another explanation is that the disciples were delusional. Some skeptics believe that the disciples, as a result of their intense grief and sorrow, only imagined seeing Jesus alive after his death on the cross. These critics claimed that the appearances were simply hallucinations that resulted from wishful thinking. The problems with this theory that they were hallucinating was that this proposal fails to explain the empty tomb and only accounts for the resurrection appearances at first glance. Sometimes, witnesses in homicide cases are related to homicide victims. Because these witnesses share relation to the victim, the grief about the loss can be profound. This profound grief can affect what they remember about the victim. For instance, they could suppress all negative characteristics of the victim's personality while amplifying the victim's virtues. Right. If they're delusional, they could choose to remember only the positive parts and choose to fail to remember the negative parts. This is normal because we all tend to think the best of someone once they've died. But even though we tend to think the best of someone once they've died, our thinking the best of them is usually limited to the nature of the victim's character and not the detailed and elaborate events that involved the victim in the past. Those closest to the victim may be mistaken about his or her character, but the entire group of loved ones is almost certainly not going to imagine an identical set of fictional events involving the victim. They're not going to all make up the same story without collusion. It's one thing to remember someone with fondness, another thing to imagine an elaborate, detailed history that didn't even occur. Based on these experiences as a detective, there are other reasonable concerns when considering the explanation that the disciples hallucinated or imagined the resurrection. First, while individuals have hallucinations, there are no examples of group hallucinations where large groups of people have the exact same hallucination. While a short, momentary group hallucination might seem reasonable, long, sustained, and detailed hallucinations are unsupported historically and intuitively unreasonable. The risen Christ was reportedly seen on more than one occasion and by a number of different groups and subsets of groups. All of these diverse sightings would have to be additional group hallucinations of one nature or another. Not all of the disciples were inclined favorably to such a hallucination. The disciples included people like Thomas, who was skeptical and did not expect Jesus to come back to life. And many of the disciples are recorded in Scripture to be sad about Jesus' death, as though they were not expecting him to rise. If the resurrection was simply a hallucination, what became of Jesus' corpse? The absence of the body is unexplainable under this scenario. Next, the disciples were fooled by an impostor. Some non-believers have argued that an impostor tricked the disciples and convinced them that Jesus was still alive. The disciples unknowingly advanced that lie. The problems with this alternative explanation to Jesus' resurrection are that while this explanation accounts for the resurrection, observations, and transformed apostles, it requires an additional set of conspirators other than the apostles who were later fooled to accomplish the task of stealing the body. Many detectives spend several years investigating fraud and forgery crimes prior to joining the homicide team. Those detectives have learned something about successful con artists. The less the victim understands about the specific topic and area in which he or she is being conned, the more likely the con artist will be successful. Victims are often fooled and swindled out of their money because they have little or no expertise in the area in which the con artist is operating. The perpetrator is able to use sophisticated language and make claims that are outside the victim's expertise. The crook sounds legitimate, primarily because the victim doesn't really know what truly is legitimate. When the targeted victim knows more about the subject than the person attempting the con, the odds are good that the perpetrator will fail at his or her attempt to fool the victim. For this reason, the proposal that a sophisticated first-century con artist fools the disciples seems unreasonable. There are many concerns with such a theory. The disciples weren't, the impersonator would have to be familiar enough with Jesus' mannerisms and statements to convince the disciples. I would think that the disciples who spent 3.5 years with Jesus on a daily basis or nearly daily basis would have a hard, would be able to tell the true Jesus from an impostor. The disciples knew the topic of the con better than anyone who might con them. Many of the disciples were skeptical and displayed none of the necessary naivety that would be required for the con artist to succeed. Thomas, for example, was openly skeptical from the beginning. The impersonator would need to possess miraculous powers. The disciples reported that the resurrected Jesus performed many miracles and convincing proofs. Who would seek to start a world religious movement, if not one of the hopeful disciples? This theory requires someone to be motivated to impersonate Jesus other than the disciples themselves. This explanation also fails to account for the empty tomb or missing body of Jesus. Next, the disciples were influenced by limited spiritual sightings. More recently, some skeptics have offered the theory that one or two of the disciples had a vision of the risen Christ and then convinced the others that these spiritual sightings were legitimate. They argue that additional sightings came as a response to the intense influence of the first visions. The problems with this idea are that this proposal may begin to explain the transformation of the apostles, but it fails to explain the empty tomb and offers an explanation of the resurrection observations that is inconsistent with the biblical record. It's not unusual to have a persuasive witness influence the beliefs of other eyewitnesses. This will be discussed in a later chapter. In some murder investigations, one emphatic witness has persuaded others that something occurred, even though the other witnesses weren't even present to see the event for themselves. But these persuaded witnesses were easily distinguished from the one who persuaded them once they are interrogated about their account of what happened. Only the one that did the persuading of them possessed the details in their most robust form. For this reason, his or her account, the account of the one that did the persuading, is typically the most comprehensive. while those that were persuaded tend to generalize since they didn't actually see the event for themselves. In addition, when pressed to repeat the story of the one persuasive witness, the other witnesses eventually pointed to that witness as their source, especially when pressured. While it's possible for a persuasive witness to convince some of the other witnesses that his or her version of the events is the true story, a persuader, one who has been persuaded, isn't as likely to convince people as the one who had the original story. The more witnesses who were involved in a crime, the less likely that all of them will be influenced by any one witness, regardless of that witness's charisma or position within the group. This theory also suffers from the liabilities of the earlier claim that the disciples imagined the resurrected Christ. Even if the persuader could convince everyone of his or her first observation, the subsequent group visions are still unreasonable for all the previously discussed reasons. There are many concerns related to the claim that a number of persuaders convinced the disciples of the resurrection. The theory fails to account for three numerous divergent and separate sightings of Jesus that are all recorded in the Gospels. These sightings are described specifically with great detail. It's not reasonable to believe that all these disciples could provide such specified detail if they were simply repeating something they didn't see for themselves, but because they did see it for themselves, they could provide detail. As many as 500 people were said to be available to testify to their observations of the risen Christ, according to Paul's letter to the Corinthians in chapter 15. Could all these people have been influenced to imagine their own observations of Jesus? It's not reasonable that a persuader equally persuaded all these disciples, even though they didn't actually see anything that was recorded. This explanation also fails to account for the empty tomb or the missing corpse. The next explanation is that the disciples' observations were distorted later. Some unbelievers claim that the original observations of the disciples were amplified and distorted as the legend of Jesus grew over time. These skeptics believe that Jesus may have been a wise teacher, but argue that the resurrection is a legendary and historically late exaggeration. The problems with this theory are that this explanation may account for the empty tomb if we assume the body was removed, but it fails to explain the early claims of the apostles related to the resurrection. We'll talk more about that in chapters 11 and 13. Cold case detectives have to deal with the issue of legend more than other types of detectives. So much time's passed from the point of the original crime that it seems possible that witnesses may now amplify their original observations in one way or another. Luckily, in those cases, Wallace has the record of the first investigators to assist him as he tries to separate what the eyewitnesses truly saw and reported at the time of the crime from what they might recall today. If the original record of the first investigators is thorough and well documented, he will have a much easier time discerning the truth about what each witness saw. First recollections of the eyewitnesses are usually more detailed and reliable than what they might offer 30 years later. Cold case detectives rely on the original reports as they compare what witnesses once said to what witnesses are saying today. The reliability of the eyewitness accounts related to the resurrection, like the reliability of the cold case eyewitness, must be confirmed by early documentation of the first investigators. For this reason, claim that the original story of Jesus was a late exaggeration is undermined by several concerns, so Jesus' story could not be a late exaggeration. In the earliest accounts of the disciples' activity after the crucifixion, the disciples are seen citing the resurrection of Jesus as their primary piece of evidence that Jesus was God. From the earliest days of the Christian movement, eyewitnesses were making this claim. The students of the disciples also recorded that the resurrection was a key component of the disciples' eyewitness testimony. That's coming in a later chapter, more on that. The earliest known Christian creed or oral record, as described in Scripture by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, includes the resurrection as a key component. This explanation also fails to account for the fact that the tomb and the body of Jesus have not been exposed to demonstrate that this late legend was false. So the other explanation, the best explanation, is that the disciples were accurately reporting the resurrection of Jesus. Christians, of course, claim that Jesus truly rose from the dead and that the Gospels are accurate eyewitness accounts of this event. There are problems even with this theory. The explanation accounts for the empty tomb, the resurrection observations, and the transformation of the apostles. It would be naive, however, to accept this explanation without recognizing the fact that it has also been a liability that has been it also has a liability that has been examined and voiced by skeptics and non-believers. The explanation of the actual resurrection, as Christians believe it, has a liability that's been examined and voiced by skeptics and non-believers. The claim that Jesus truly rose from the dead presents the following concern and objection. The concern, singular, and objection, singular, is that this explanation requires a belief in the supernatural, a belief that Jesus had the supernatural power to rise from the dead in the first place. Now let's look at abductive reasoning and the resurrection. The evidence was limited to 4 modest claims about the resurrection, and explanatory options to all possibilities, both natural and supernatural, were left open. The last explanation, although miraculous and supernatural, suffers from the least number of liabilities and deficiencies. The supernatural explanation that Jesus actually did rise from the dead suffers from the least number of liabilities and deficiencies. If we simply enter into the investigation without a pre-existing bias against anything supernatural, as discussed in the previous chapter dealing with bias, the final explanation that Jesus did actually rise from the dead accounts for all the evidence without any difficulty. The final explanation accounts for the evidence most simply and most exhaustively, and it is logically consistent if we simply allow for God's existence in the first place. The final explanation is also superior to the other accounts, given that it does not suffer from all the problems we see with the other explanations. So because Jesus died and was buried, and the tomb was empty, and the disciples claimed to see Jesus resurrected, and the disciples were transformed, the most reasonable explanation for that is that the reporting, as recorded in Scripture, that he actually died, was buried, and rose again, is logical and evidential. If we approach the issue of the resurrection in an unbiased manner, we dealt with bias in the previous chapter, without the presuppositions described in the previous chapter, and if we assess it as we evaluated the dead body scene, we can judge the possible explanations and eliminate those explanations that are unreasonable. The conclusion that Jesus was resurrected, as reported in the Gospels, can be sensibly inferred from the available evidence. So the resurrection is reasonable. So now we'll look at the next tool for the call-out bag. Okay, let's add another tool to our call-out bag, an attitude about reason that will help us discuss the claims of Christianity. Like other non-believers in our world today, Wallace used to think of faith as the opposite of reason. Yeah, I can think of one famous atheist, Sam Harris, I'll mention his name. He likes to use the term reason as though it's the opposite of having faith. So Harris does exactly what Wallace is talking about here. He thinks of faith as the opposite of reason. In this characterization of the dichotomy, Wallace believed that atheists were reasonable freethinkers, while believers were simple, mindless drones who blindly followed unreasonable teaching of their leadership. And that's exactly how the atheists like Harris characterize the Christians today. But if you think about it, Wallace says faith is actually the opposite of unbelief. Faith is the opposite of unbelief. Reason is not the opposite of unbelief. If you think about it, faith is actually the opposite of unbelief. Faith is not the opposite of reason. Faith is the opposite of unbelief. Faith is not the opposite of reason. As he began to read through the Bible as a skeptic, Wallace came to understand that the biblical definition of faith is a well-placed and reasonable inference based on evidence. Right. I can truly say today that I believe Christianity to be true because of the evidence, and that's why I have this channel, to introduce people to the evidence for Christianity in more of an academic form compared to some of the other channels that are out there who have a similar goal to me. So you can have faith that God exists, that Christianity is true, that Jesus really did rise again, and you can have evidence to undergird that faith. So Wallace came to understand the biblical definition of faith as a well-placed and reasonable inference based on evidence. Wallace wasn't raised in a Christian culture, and he has an unusually high amount of respect for evidence. Right, as a detective, he has a high respect for evidence. Perhaps this is why this definition of faith, comes easily to him. That faith is the opposite of unbelief. Not that faith is the opposite of reason. Wallace understands that it is possible for reasonable people to examine evidence and conclude that Christianity is true, based on the examination of the evidence. While skeptics may not agree on how the evidence related to the resurrection should be interpreted, reasonable conclusions about the evidence can still be reached. Many devoted, committed Christians are hesitant to embrace an evidential faith. In many Christian circles, faith that requires evidential support is seen as weak and inferior. For many, blind faith, a faith that simply trusts without question, is the truest, most sincere, and most valuable form of faith we can offer God. Yet Jesus seemed to have a high regard for evidence. In John 14:11, he told those watching him to examine the evidence of the miracles if they did not believe what he said about his identity. Even after the resurrection, Jesus stayed with his disciples for an additional 40 days and provided them with many convincing proofs that he was resurrected and was who he claimed to be. Jesus understood the role and value of evidence and the importance of developing an evidential faith. It's time for all of us as Christians to develop a similarly reasonable faith. So that's the end of Chapter 2 in Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. Next time we will look at Chapter 3, Principle 3, and learn how to think circumstantially. Because the case for God's existence and the case for Christianity is largely built on circumstantial evidence. There's a series of facts, many facts, and you can make an inference to the best explanation to those facts. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please have a blessed rest of your day. I see the